Thank you very much.
Thank
you. Well, I don't think we need to introduce ourselves now that you've introduced us. Thank you very much. I'm just checking if you can see the shared screen. Yes, everybody? Can you see the shared screen?
No, ma'am.
Not yet.
Oh, you can't. Oh, here we go. Hang on. Oh, sorry. I have got a problem now. I won't be a second. My Zoom. Oh, no. I'm sorry, my Zoom window has just quit. What am I doing? Zoom us meeting. Exit minimal view. Yeah, I'm back again. Thank you. Can you see that now?
Perfect. Yes.
Yes.
Thank you. It just went off. So what Sally and I have arranged for this presentation is that he is going to talk about Emily Dickinson's poem, The Letter to the World, which was the inspiration for the film. And then I'm going to present the process of the research and the making of the film before we play it at the end. Is that okay, Sally?
Yes, absolutely perfect.
So what I'm going to do now,
yeah,
what I'm going to do now is just, is
perfect.
Can you see that now? Yes.
Absolutely,
Okay.
yes.
Sally's going to kick off and then I'm going to follow her. Thanks, Sally.
Thank you, Susie. So this is the tiny parcel of words which inspired us to make what is, I suppose, a very compact and compressed documentary animation in which Susie and I have tried to draw together various aspects of Emily Dickinson's lived experience, her biography, her life as she experienced it day to day, but also the way in which she produced her extraordinary body of work, her extraordinary corpus, and in particular, the sorts of images that we encounter when we read her poetry. And as you can see from this very simple poem, it reads, I'm going to read it to you in a moment, it reads like, and looks like, in some ways, like a hymn. And indeed, one of her main inspirations was the hymnal form, sometimes called the ballad form of meter. And as I read it to you, I want you to hear, and even just close your eyes perhaps, but hear the sounds of the words and think about what sound rises to the surface, because there is a dominant sound here. This is my letter to the world that never wrote to me. The simple news that nature told with tender majesty. Her message is committed to hands I cannot see. For love of her, sweet countrymen, judge tenderly of me. And I'll read it one more time. This is my letter to the world that never wrote to me. The simple news that nature told with tender majesty. Her message is committed to hands I cannot see. For love of her, sweet countrymen, judge tenderly of me. And it's that long sound of the E which trails around in this poem, the E sound, which is there in letter, although we don't hear it so much, but it's there. It's there in almost every single line of this poem. Letter to the world never wrote to me, the simple news that nature told with tender majesty. Her message is committed to hands I cannot see. For love of her, sweet countrymen, judge tenderly of me. There are two me's here. And it's that long E sound that we hear above all else. And the repetition of the me brings us back, I think, to a very private sense of Emily Dickinson. The self that we cannot necessarily see, but we can hear nonetheless. So I want us to consider, perhaps, that aspect of me that she repeats here. And I want us to think about another word as well, which you can also see just beneath the little poem. And it is a very small poem. Emily Dickinson wrote, I think she wrote in a very compressed way, thinking about the way in which the world can be compressed and compacted and folded down into small parcels. She wrote, imagining, I think, sometimes that she was writing on nature and through nature. She wrote a series of letters and poems, and the word that springs to mind to try and summarize the craft and the art of her writing is the word fascicles. After she died, 1,107 odd, I think it is, were found of her tiny poetry fascicles were left behind in a rosewood chest inside her bedroom in Amherst, in Massachusetts, on the east coast of America. And the word fascicles means leaves, leaves. So when we think of Emily Dickinson writing, we think immediately of the texture and the shape of nature. She wrote, as I imagine it, quite literally on leaves, leaves of paper, but thinking also about the texture and the movement of nature, the leaves of the trees outside her window. Leaves, trees, me, all of these sounds bring me back to that one word which hovers underneath this little letter poem, because in some sense it is a letter that she's sending out to the world. She's sending it out to the world who didn't write back to her, so she tells us, but she's also sending it back to herself, which is why we hear the word me and that E sound. She's writing to herself. And in that sense, she's speaking in the tradition of poetry, of lyrical poetry, which John Stuart Mill, the Victorian man of letters, philosopher, and also autobiographer, defined as this. He tells us, John Stuart Mill, in his famous definition of poetry, that poetry is the sound of the spoken voice, the lyrical I, being overheard. Being overheard. And I think that what we hear in this little poem, Letter to the World, is the sound of Emily Dickinson speaking out loud to herself. And I think that to summarize that, we just need to consider really one word, and it comes just under here. She wrote to her friend, Thomas Wentworth Higginson, who was somebody who did write back to her. He was a retired army officer, and he was also quite involved in the abolition movement. But he was very prominent as a man of letters and a man defining poetic tastes in the 1860s, which is when Dickinson's work really came to fruition, when she began to mature as a poet during the time of the American Civil War. Higginson wrote back to her, having read a few of her poems, and she writes this to him. So they develop a rather intimate conversation through letters. A letter always feels to me like immortality, because it is the mind alone, without corporeal friend. A letter always feels to me, so there she is addressing herself as well as her recipient in the objective voice, the reflexive me. A letter always feels to me like immortality, because it is the mind alone without corporeal friend. In other words, the letter form, as Dickinson understood it, was her way of writing herself into the atmosphere, the sound, the shape of what she called immortality. And then you hear that E sound again, that long E sound. She was drawing herself, as she imagined, into a space which she imagined to be heaven, whatever heaven was. And I'm going to suggest to you very briefly, as I hand over now to Suzie, that heaven for Emily Dickinson was a form of the Garden of Eden. It was a place where nature shaped reality, because nature, in the end, was, I think, probably her first companion and her true corporeal friend. So I now want to hand over to Suzie, who's going to open up perhaps some of those ideas. But just to say one final time that there's something in the nature of Dickinson's soundscape, as well as her imagescape, I think, that makes me somehow want to lift my voice up and sing the words as well. You know, there's a sort of sing-song quality to what seems to be a very simple poem. And Suzie and I, in our research, we did explore the nature of song and lyrics and hymns and ballads. And indeed, that became part of our later research when we began to work with musicians. But I think it's that E sound that I take away with me, and it makes me think also of the idea of thee being whoever thee is, perhaps God, but another self that she's longing to have communion with. So Suzie, over to you.
Thank you, Sally. That was great. I'd forgotten all of that detail and now it's back. Okay, so I'm just going to say something about the title.
Yeah.
There is a form of animation which calls itself documentary animation. And I think that Sally and I, the take we had on this project was that it was absolutely based in documents.
Yeah.
So we used a lot of documentary research in order to create a basis for the film. And so this presentation is really going through this kind of process of research and how we came up with a form for representing the poet through the idea of her poem, Letter to the World.
Mm.
I don't know what you know about Emily Dickinson, but she lived a life with her parents at home. She was someone who spent a lot of time in nature, in the garden, and in a way, she was away from the hustle and bustle of what we might call normal life, having a job or a husband or children. So we did a lot of research into her autobiography, which I would say if you want to learn more about her, it's the best way to go about it. Particularly, I'll recommend some literature in a little while. But so we started with looking at, I suppose, her daily life. And so here's a little slide with, you know, her writing. She's writing to Higginson. That's her room, which has been kind of preserved in the house that she lived in. There's a dress that she wore. Interesting, this dress has pockets, which is significant because Emily was a person who always had something to write with, something to write on, things she'd picked and put in her pockets. So this was a woman in the 19th century who wore a dress with pockets into which she put things that interested her on her walks around. And famously, her herbarium, it has all been digitized and you can access that online. And this is something that I suppose was particularly a feminine pastime, and men did it as well. But I think a herbarium was something that women did at the time, who made these kind of almost as sketchbooks of nature, properly labeled, beautifully set out. And this herbarium and the dress and the letters and the space she lived in were all evidence for the way that we approached the film. And what we needed to do was identify her tropes, so things that she was always coming up with. As Sally says, she was writing to herself. She was commenting on the world, on nature, on possibly on God. She would write about distant lands that she'd never visited. She had an obsession for volcanoes. These things that excited her, geographical things. She had quite an architectural view. She looked at the angle of the landscape. So her language crosses all these kind of forms of mathematics, of geography. And I suppose a lot of it was to do with the macroscope and the microscope. So she had a very microscopic vision. She would, if you look at the Titanic opera that the insects make, when she's listening to sounds, tiny sounds lying in the garden, and they become almost too loud to bear. So she has this way of listening and looking and commenting, which has a very microscopic view, but also looking at the landscape, the distant mountains, not even in the country she lives in.
I think Suzie, I think she read the Atlantic Monthly actually, and she saw images there because Higginson, that's how she got to know Higginson. She corresponded because he was editor of the Atlantic Monthly at some point, or he was very involved, and he used to, I think, be in charge of poetry. but she would sometimes see pictures of Italy. I think that's where
That's
she
right.
first started getting involved with the idea of Italy. Yes.
But I think also the volcanoes, there was some evidence from her
Yeah.
childhood, from her textbooks, where, you know,
Yes.
she's, you know, the kind of diagrams of how volcanoes operated. And she, I think
Yes.
she related to that in emotional terms as
Yeah.
her own kind of inner volcano, which we did visit in this film. So looking at the time she lived in, which was the time of the Civil War, which impacted, Emily could actually hear battles from where she lived. And there were graveyards, you know, full of the dead from the war. And something we found were these maps, which were popular at the time, panoramic maps, which invited tourists, you know, bloody tourism, where you could go and watch a battle. It would show you where to go and watch a battle. So there's this sort of horrific interest, and maps are something that we became quite interested in the production of this film, as you will see shortly. As Sally has said, she was a prolific letter writer, and here is a letter to Higginson where she's mentioning Sir Thomas Browne. I think Sir Thomas Browne might be of particular interest to me because I live in the city where Thomas Browne lived, and I'm just going to show you one of the texts that she would have been familiar with, which was Thomas Browne's Religio Medici. And if you think about, he was a, you know, he like Emily Dickinson, he was a close observer of nature and trying to describe it in very original terms. And what he's saying there, he says, why not go to school to the wisdom of bees, ants, which are ants, and spiders? What wise hand teacheth them to do what reason cannot teach us? So he here is saying that insects are just as important as, you know, elephants. And
Yes.
he says that there's more curious mathematics, and the civility of these citizens are more neatly set forth. They more neatly set forth the wisdom of their maker. And so Emily's not just reading the Atlantic Monthly, she's reading Shakespeare, she's reading Thomas Browne. You know, she's getting her hands on all sorts of historical and contemporary literature from the time. Yes. And so this is part of our documentary research, is looking at the things that she was reading.
Yes. And it's interesting there, Suzie, how he plays with size. He goes from ants and spiders to whales and dromedaries in one line, right?
Yeah. Exactly. And in that poem, Letters to the World, this is a small letter she's writing, but she's writing it to the world. You know, so there's even this massive scale in the letter, this small woman in North America writing a letter to the rest of the world, you know. So this was something, the scale was something that we had to try and work on in the film. So here is some early conversation with Sally going on here, where I'm making notes on a conversation that we're having while we're having it. And here, Sally obviously is mentioning to me Walt Whitman, she's mentioning Elizabeth Barrett Brown. These are, you know, she's mentioning Shakespeare, we're looking at the herbarium. And here I can see there's an idea that really took off. It says the herbarium, we're going to bring the dead plants back to life. And when you see the film, you'll see that that's something that we did. I made a big firework display out of flowers at the end of the film. We're looking at things that would have been around this lens developments at the time, things like Herschel's telescope. We're thinking about, you know, Emily Dickinson probably saw lantern shows. So looking at the kind of, the film was invented just, I think just after she died. I think 2 years after Emily died, primitive film was starting to happen. So she was at this quite an exciting time to do with lens technology. So where are we now? So I got here, this is Sally's suggestions for focus, and we were looking at the miniature, which was also the realm of the private. And how the bee in particular, we were focusing on her relationship with the bee. And I remember Sally telling me how that in Shakespeare, a bee is significant in that it could stand for being. So it can be the person as well as the insect. A bee is kind of short for being. And if you look at her relationship with insects and how she wrote about these very small forms of life, birds and bees, the bee became quite an important character, if you like, in the film.
And the bee carries that sound that she loves, the long E sound, right? The me, the ye, the thee, the see, those sounds she adores. Yeah.
And I'll mention the soundtrack, although I wasn't going to mention it at this point, but it's a good point to mention it. The soundtrack was developed by our friend, the composer Tom Simmons. And in the end, the soundtrack is almost the noise in Emily Dickinson's head, which is a kind of an E sound. It's like a drone. He actually created this sound rather as you play a wine glass with your finger. He created the sound by making drones from water in jam jars, this kind of enclosed space. So the water, if you like, is like Emily's brain inside this glass object, and that's what you hear. And it's this kind of almost a cycling E sound, which is rather relevant, I suppose. I hadn't thought of it before, but it's rather relevant to the sound of the bee. Yes, convicted could we be of our minutiae, the smaller citizen that flies has more integrity. And so this idea that the film is almost these small cameos, these detailed cameos of Emily's interaction with very small forms of life, and how she found that fascinating and expanded it into much bigger ideas. So those are my very early sketches of ideas. And the next thing
she was also sorry, Susie, just very quickly, she was also very she drew from Shakespeare. She drew from Shakespeare, I think, a lot of her imagery of jewels and gems, because Shakespeare's language has a lot of gems and jewel imagery. So you know, and England is often compared to you know, the jewel in the sea, that idea, you know, in Richard II, for example. So she's always stealing, like a little bird, going around stealing other people's images, and she never quotes Shakespeare, which I found fascinating. But there's a kind of palimpsest of Shakespeare and his understanding of metaphor and his sound and his images under the texture of hers as well. But she would never quote another writer directly, interestingly.
Yeah, maybe that's because she wasn't schooled, because she's an autodidact.
Yes.
She created her own texts. She found her own research.
Yes.
I think that, you know, as modern academics, we're expected to reveal sources and influences. But with Emily, it was a very private, really a very private practice.
Yes.
And although it was a letter to the world, it was one that she put in a fascicle and hid in a drawer.
Yes.
Yeah, so she didn't have to justify herself to other people.
Yeah.
Anyway, so this next slide is really about the development of a film, where you're trying to find what are scenes, what are turning points, how do you keep the viewer's interest, how do you build a kind of a story from quite random research elements to make it into a whole. So this, again, Sally and I would have been discussing this while I'm trying to build scenes from the discussions. And we had lots of ideas about this, as you can see. I don't know if I can, Anatomy of Ruin, it says there, which is also, you know, Emily Dickinson, we were comparing her a little bit to Sylvia Plath, really, and how, you know, how she really describes the body as well as the world outside, and how this internal and external poetry, this poetry of the internal and the external. But we feel that, you know, a lot of her poetry is really looking towards the sunset, you know, bringing the sunset in a cup, this end of the day, this end of life, this sort of embracing the idea of death in many ways, you know. And I'll talk about some more research in a minute, which is relevant, I feel. So there we are.
The film itself, Susie, carries it basically shaped around a whole day, isn't it? The diurnal cycle of the day and the night.
I suppose it is. I hadn't thought of that, but I think you're right, it does. Anyway, so this is the visual development. So this is not a storyboard. This is what's called a mood board. So here I've got images of Amherst, where she lived, things from the Emily Dickinson Museum site, that, you know, her posting a letter across the world out to, you know, the distant mountains. Her idea of the, she talked about, is it the rim of blue? Sally, give me this. This is about the edge of the atmosphere, the outer, you know, the ozone layer, if you like, is what we call it now. She's looking at beyond the world. So her letters are going right up into the atmosphere and then coming back down somewhere else. So this is me trying to work out a way of animating her idea of where are these letters to the world going? They're going right out into the planets. They're not just, you know, the world to her is not just the Earth. It's kind of the stars, the whole universe. And then there's Emily alone in her room, thinking, looking out of the window, pondering. You know, she thought a lot. And she spent time in her room every day at some point writing. But as I said before, she had pockets, and she'd have bits of butter paper in her pockets, and she would write notes and small poems, observations on any paper she could find. So she had this outdoor life and this indoor life. I just go to the next image.
Yeah, I think that idea of the rim is really interesting, Susie. It is like we were trying to get at that, I think, with the edges. We were thinking about outlines and edges and where the sky and the sea meet, where the grass meets the sky. That sort of idea is, you know, beyond the horizon, beyond what you can see as well. You know, where does she go beyond what she cannot see, i.e. towards immortality? So yes, the edge is very important, I think, to the film's aesthetic.
I mean, the word that people now would use is liminal, sort of liminal space. Although people use that so much, I'm quite allergic to the term. But
I like edge. I think edge is good.
Edge is better. So again, this thing that was the indoors, and this is the outdoors. And at one point, we thought about having Higginson, who, you know, she obviously was, you know, in communication with him. He was one of those people that actually communicated, of having him as a kind of a bee, a bit like Alice in Wonderland. But it was a bit too Alice in Wonderland, so went away from that idea. And the other idea that we didn't take on was more of this kind of fantasy land, because in a way, you know, Emily Dickinson was very, very focused on the real, and she didn't anthropomorphize animals and bees. She wasn't anthropomorphizing them. So we didn't anthropomorphize them, really, a little bit, but not in terms of human characters. So we had this idea of making it more of a kind of fantasy, but decided against it. And then this is a very basic storyboard. I have to apologize because this is the kind of storyboard that I tend to make, that I understand, and it is me who's got to make the film. So these are scenarios that, in fact, we worked with, and I will just go next to the development of the image process. So this is when I was still thinking about Higginson as a bee. And these were some tests that I made using my friend who's a puppeteer, Joy, in the studio, just using shadow work. And I thought this had a very contemporaneous feel for Emily Dickinson, where she would have been familiar with silhouette cuts, with Magic Lantern shows, and you know, this is the way that I went with the aesthetics. And in the end, this is how we shot the film. So Elizabeth Gray, who is an American actress who you see on the right, I animated her frame by frame. So I used her like a puppet. So there was no natural movement in the film. So all the film was animated. This is called pixelation, which is where you take a still frame, somebody moves, you take another one. And this was the setup, and this is what the setup looked like when I had a huge piece of paper in front of it and lights behind. So this was trying to recreate really Emily in her room. And I tried to be as authentic as I could in terms of the table, the furniture, the silhouette, and the kind of window. The image in the window, not that it's probably relevant to you, but to me it was, it's a very close-up image of a butterfly wing. So there's lots of detail in the film, which is quite subtle, which I think aesthetically it works, but maybe the detail of the rationale is not that obvious. I'm just going to put some notes here.
And you can see, Suzie, you can see the blue edge there very clearly, right, in the window
yes,
frame.
yeah, the colour scheme of the film is very much to do with the kind of blue, but which I'll refer to a bit later. There's a lot of blue in Emily's poems, a lot of colour in her poems, but blue is particularly noticeable. So this, apart from pixelating the actress, I made a puppet of the actress, a little cutout one. The one on the right was a test. The one on the left is the one I used. And this is how I filmed the puppet sections on a multiplane. So these are the layers of glass with the puppet on one layer and then the cutout scenery and other things on other layers. So when you see the film, you have to bear in mind it's not all digital trickery. A lot of it is really old-fashioned animation process. Because in a way, I was thinking about Emily in her time and the kind of making of things that would have been available to her and her contemporaries, which is cutting things out, shining a light, making these, shapes and in a playful way. And, it's quite old-fashioned. So I'm just going to come to this map. As I did show you the map from the Civil War. I did not draw this map. I commissioned it from another artist called Krista Harris. And I asked her to make a map that the world would make of Emily. So this map is kind of the letter that the world writes to Emily. Because if the world was writing a letter, it would be a map. But because Emily is referencing herself, the map actually contains pieces of her poetry. And they are the bits of her poetry where she's quite self-deprecating. The way that she thinks the world sees her. You never wed. She's not much of a woman. She never wed. She sings too loud in church. These are things she wrote about herself. So we kind of picked on these rather critical, when she was being critical of herself, because she thought the world was critical of her. So this odd map is something that is sent back to Emily in the film, and she undoes it and responds to it. There's another thing about this. There's another thing about this section of the film where Emily receives her letter from the world. We at the time that we were making this, I'm just trying to think of her name. It's gone. Lyndall
Gordon.
Okay,
Lyndall
so
Gordon.
Lyndall Gordon. About the time we were actually making this film, Lyndall Gordon brought out the most brilliant biography of Emily Dickinson, absolutely fantastic, where she posited that Emily Dickinson was
epileptic.
Sorry, I've lost my thread now. Was epileptic. And this really rather tied into the way that I was making the film. And it's when she gets the letter from the world, she can't cope with it. In the film, she really does react quite strongly to having her own work thrown back at her. And this very much tied in with this idea of epilepsy. So Lyndall Gordon was saying, I lived my life a smoking gun. I felt a funeral in my brain. That in her poetry, there are lots of references to what could be epileptic seizures. And this would also create a rationale for Emily living at home with her family. At the time.
It was called Lives Like Loaded Guns, I think. That was her subtitle.
Lives Like Loaded Guns. Yeah, I should have written this down in my notes, Sally, and I didn't.
I put it in the chat. I just put it in the chat. It's in the chat.
Oh, thank you for doing that. It's a brilliant read and well worth it. So when we use the map in the film and Emily receives it, we were also responding to very new research into Emily Dickinson. So this, I think, is pretty much one of the last slides. This is about the soundtrack. In the film, the soundtrack is this, what we call Stimmung, which is German kind of soul singing. And it's something that Stockhausen was very keen on. So the idea is that it's almost your inner voice that is making a sound. The only spoken words in the film are in the middle when the letter from the world arrives, and Emily is speaking. Well, not Emily, an actress who had the same accent was speaking the words of the poet, and these are the self-deprecatory words when she receives this letter from the world. But apart from that, the whole soundtrack is quite claustrophobic. And it's this kind of drone that's going on. It's almost as if we're inside Emily's own head, with this kind of rotating, cyclic kind of drone, a bit like an insect sound.
Almost as though we passed into her brain, almost, because she uses the word brain a lot, almost as though we were inside her, a kind of stethoscope of her brain almost. Yeah,
and that was Tom's contribution to the film, but we were very happy with that. So the film, one more thing. So these are responses to Emily Dickinson from the artist Kiki Smith on the left, which is an etching made by stabbing a needle into metal, and the one on the right by Joseph Cornell, which is an homage to Emily Dickinson. So, and it's called Beyond the Blue.
Yes,
Beyond the Blue Peninsula.
Yeah.
And I think that the film that we made is very much along the lines of both these images. So as an artist's response to Emily Dickinson, I would say that the film very much fits into the same ideas that are going on in these other artists' responses. Something that I had to avoid, and I'll just show you the last slide, was this, because at the beginning of the project, these were the kind of experiments that I was making. I liked the idea of Emily, with her gun being a kind of playing card, which were also the kind of things she probably played cards. I don't know, but I would imagine that everybody in that house played cards. So I went away from this whole idea of caricature into the film that you're going to see. And I suppose I'll put this up just to say there are so many ways of approaching a subject. And what you have to do as an artist is try and be truthful in your representation of the subject and not go off on your own little peccadillos.
Yes.
Because this would have been a comedy, wouldn't it? So I'll exit on this point, because I don't think that Emily Dickinson's life was a comedy at all. I think that her life was a very serious business, and I think that her legacy of poetry is phenomenal and contributes a great deal to all the people who read it. That's my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Suzie. Thank you.